Most heroes don't disappear on the battlefield. They disappear in plain sight, surrounded by people who no longer remember what they once gave away. On a gray Tuesday morning in early November, Mercy General Hospital carried on with the familiar rhythm of organized urgency. Nurses hurried between patient rooms, monitors chimed softly in the distance, and families gathered around the reception desk, hoping for answers that never seemed to come quickly enough. Nobody noticed the elderly man sitting alone in the farthest chair of the waiting area. His weathered brown coat had clearly seen better years, and the faded cap resting gently in his lap looked older than some of the nurses walking past him. He wasn't asking for attention. He wasn't complaining. He simply waited with the quiet patience of someone who had spent an entire lifetime learning that waiting was often part of service. Before we continue this remarkable story, thank you for supporting our channel. Every view, every kind comment, and every moment you spend watching means more than you know. If you enjoy stories about courage, honor, and the extraordinary people hidden among ordinary lives, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing even more unforgettable journeys with you in the videos ahead. The automatic entrance doors opened every few seconds as more patients arrived, yet no one glanced twice at the old man except to walk around him. A mother gently pulled her young son toward another row of chairs. A businessman sighed impatiently when he realized the elderly stranger occupied the seat closest to the coffee machine. The receptionist briefly looked up from her computer, assumed he had already checked in, and immediately returned to answering phone calls. It wasn't cruelty. It was something far more common. It was indifference. The man's name was Walter Hayes, 82 years old. His hands rested calmly on a polished wooden cane that had been repaired so many times it almost seemed held together by memory rather than glue. His breathing was steady, although slower than it had once been decades ago. His eyes wandered across the busy emergency department, observing people the way old soldiers often observe a room, quietly noticing every movement without drawing attention to themselves. Walter carried no expensive luggage, wore no medals on his chest, and displayed nothing that suggested he had once lived a life worthy of history books. Only a small bronze lapel pin, nearly hidden beneath the collar of his worn coat, reflected the fluorescent lights for a brief second before disappearing back into shadow. Hundreds of people would have walked past without ever seeing it. Grace Mitchell almost did. She had just finished a 12-hour overnight shift in the emergency department. Her navy blue scrubs were neatly pressed despite the long hours. Her dark hair pulled into a practical bun, and the exhaustion behind her calm expression remained invisible to everyone except herself. She moved through the waiting room carrying a clipboard, reviewing patient information before finally heading home for the first real sleep she had planned in nearly 24 hours. Halfway across the lobby, something made her slow down. She couldn't explain why at first. It wasn't Walter's face. It wasn't his age. It wasn't even the cane resting beside his chair. It was the tiny bronze pin beneath his coat collar. Her eyes locked onto it for only a heartbeat before her feet stopped moving entirely. Every sound around her seemed to fade into the background. Conversations became distant echoes. Monitor alarms blended into silence. Grace stared at the nearly invisible emblem with an expression no one around her understood, because in that single impossible moment, she wasn't looking at an elderly man waiting patiently in a hospital lobby anymore. She was looking at a symbol she never expected to see again. Grace Mitchell remained perfectly still for several long seconds, her eyes fixed on the tiny bronze emblem that most people would have mistaken for an ordinary decorative pin. She had seen that insignia only a handful of times in her life, never in a hospital waiting room, and certainly never resting quietly beneath the collar of an elderly man whose worn clothing caused everyone around him to look the other way. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from recognition. Years earlier, during specialized military medical training that she rarely spoke about, one of her instructors had spent nearly an entire afternoon explaining the history behind that small emblem. It was never sold in stores. It was never handed out for ceremonies. It belonged only to a remarkably small group of service members whose actions had quietly changed the lives of countless others. Grace had assumed she would never encounter one in person. She took one cautious step closer, pretending to review the patient list on her clipboard while allowing herself another brief glance. The bronze had faded with age, but the shape was unmistakable. Walter Hayes noticed her standing nearby and offered the kind of gentle smile older people often gave strangers without expecting anything in return. It was warm, polite, and entirely without self-importance. Grace returned the smile almost automatically before lowering her eyes again, suddenly aware that staring would be disrespectful. Across the waiting room, the morning continued without interruption. A receptionist called another patient's name. Someone complained quietly about the estimated wait time. A delivery worker pushed a cart stacked with fresh linens through the hallway. Life moved forward exactly as it had 5 minutes earlier because nobody else had noticed what Grace had seen. Dr. Brandon Keller emerged from the emergency department carrying a tablet, scanning the crowded waiting room with the practiced efficiency of someone responsible for keeping patient flow moving on schedule. He paused briefly when he saw Walter still sitting alone. "Has anyone called transportation for that gentleman yet?" he asked without slowing his pace. One of the administrative assistants glanced toward Walter before answering. "Not yet. He has been sitting there almost an hour. I think he came in alone." Dr. Keller nodded absent-mindedly. "Make sure someone checks if he filled out his paperwork correctly. Sometimes older patients miss a few pages." He continued walking before anyone could respond further. Grace watched the brief exchange with quiet discomfort. Nobody had asked Walter how he was feeling. Nobody had introduced themselves. Nobody had even addressed him by name. He had become another item on a busy morning checklist, another face blending into the background of fluorescent lights and waiting room chairs. Walter remained completely composed. His hands rested lightly on the polished handle of his cane while his gaze wandered toward a television mounted silently above the reception desk. The morning news displayed images of an upcoming Veterans Day ceremony scheduled later that week. Several uniformed service members appeared on the screen as reporters discussed local events honoring military families. Walter looked at the broadcast for only a moment before calmly turning his attention toward the large windows overlooking the parking lot. There was no disappointment in his expression. If anything, there was acceptance, as though he had grown accustomed to watching the world remember service only on certain holidays before quietly returning to ordinary life. Grace lowered her clipboard and took a slow breath. Something inside her refused to let the moment pass. Years of emergency medicine had taught her to trust the feeling that appeared without explanation, the quiet instinct that often noticed important details before logic caught up. She glanced once more at the bronze emblem, then at Walter's calm face, and finally at the patient chart she had almost forgotten she was carrying. One simple question echoed through her thoughts with growing urgency. What if the man everyone believed was just another elderly patient was someone whose story had never truly been forgotten, only quietly overlooked by a world moving too fast to recognize him anymore? Grace knew she could not simply walk up to the elderly man and ask about the bronze emblem. If she was wrong, she would embarrass both of them. If she was right, the question deserved far more respect than casual curiosity. She turned toward the nurse's station instead, setting her clipboard on the counter while quietly opening the electronic patient queue. Walter Hayes, 82 years old, mild dizziness, fatigue, referred by a neighborhood clinic after several weeks of persistent weakness. Nothing about the medical summary appeared unusual. No special alerts. No priority designation. No notes indicating military service. It was as though an entire lifetime had been reduced to 4 brief lines on a computer screen. Grace frowned slightly. She had seen this happen before. Electronic records captured medications, allergies, and insurance information, but they rarely captured sacrifice, character, or history. Behind her, Dr. Brandon Keller walked back toward the nurse's station while reviewing laboratory reports. He noticed Grace standing motionless in front of the computer. "Mitchell, your shift ended 20 minutes ago," he said without looking up from his tablet. "Go home. We have enough coverage." Grace hesitated for only a moment. "Dr. Keller, the gentleman in the waiting room, Walter Hayes. Has anyone spoken with him personally yet?" Keller finally glanced toward the crowded lobby before shrugging. "He is stable. Triage already evaluated him. He can wait like everyone else." Grace nodded politely, but something about the answer left her unsettled. Stable did not mean invisible. Stable did not mean unimportant. Yet the pace of a busy hospital often blurred those distinctions until people became little more than names moving through a schedule. As Keller disappeared into the emergency department again, Grace quietly logged out of the patient system. She slipped her identification badge into her pocket, knowing she was technically off duty now. Even so, her feet refused to carry her toward the employee exit. Instead, she walked slowly toward the reception desk. "Has Mr. Hayes been offered any water?" she asked the receptionist. The young woman blinked in surprise before checking the chart. I am not sure. I thought one of the volunteers already did." Grace glanced toward the volunteer station. It was empty. "I do not think anyone has." Without another word, she picked up a paper cup, filled it with fresh water, and carried it across the waiting room herself. Walter looked up as she approached. "Good morning, sir," Grace said warmly. "I realized no one had brought you anything to drink." His eyes softened with genuine appreciation rather than surprise. "That is very kind of you," he replied as he accepted the cup carefully with both hands. His voice carried the calm steadiness of someone who had spent decades speaking only when necessary. "Hospitals stay busy. I understand." Grace smiled gently. "Sometimes they become so busy that we forget the small things." Walter chuckled quietly. The small things usually matter the most. The simple sentence lingered in Grace's mind far longer than she expected. She noticed his hands as he lifted the cup. They were aged, marked by time, yet remarkably steady. The bronze emblem rested just inches from her view beneath the edge of his coat. She resisted every temptation to ask about it. Instead, she looked toward the empty chair beside him. "May I sit with you for a minute?" Walter nodded. "Of course." Grace settled into the chair, saying nothing for several seconds. Around them, people continued walking past without paying attention. A child cried briefly before being comforted by his mother. An elderly couple discussed insurance forms. The television quietly displayed another story about upcoming Veterans Day events. Walter watched the screen for only a brief moment before returning his attention to the hospital lobby. Grace followed his gaze. Then she noticed something she had missed before. Resting beside Walter's cane was a neatly folded leather document holder, its edges worn smooth after years of careful use. As Walter shifted slightly in his chair, the holder opened just enough for Grace to catch the faint outline of an old military identification card tucked safely inside. Her heartbeat quickened once again. The bronze emblem had not been a coincidence. Grace kept her expression calm, but her thoughts were racing faster than they had during any emergency she had faced that month. The worn leather holder had been opened for only a second before Walter gently closed it again, completely unaware that she had noticed the old military identification tucked safely inside. It was not the document itself that unsettled her. It was the date she had managed to glimpse before it disappeared. The identification had been issued decades earlier, long before she was born. Combined with the bronze emblem beneath his collar, it formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. She remembered sitting in a quiet classroom years ago while a retired Navy medical instructor spoke to a group of young military nurses. He had placed photographs on the projector one after another, never mentioning famous generals or decorated politicians. Instead, he spoke about ordinary-looking men and women whose names were almost unknown outside military circles. The greatest heroes, he had told them, are usually the ones who never introduce themselves as heroes. Grace had never forgotten those words. Walter took another small sip of water before carefully placing the paper cup on the chair beside him. "Thank you again," he said softly. Most people are too busy to notice an old man sitting quietly. Grace looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes people are busy. Sometimes they simply stop looking." Walter smiled with surprising warmth. "That happens more often than we like to admit." For a few peaceful seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt respectful, as though both understood that conversations worth remembering did not need to be rushed. Finally, Grace asked the question that had been quietly waiting in her mind. "Sir, may I ask if you served in the military?" Walter looked toward the television before answering. Images of American flags and veterans participating in community events continued playing silently across the screen. He nodded once. "A long time ago." Grace waited for him to continue, but he did not volunteer another word. There was no pride in his voice, no desire to impress anyone. Simply a brief answer followed by another quiet smile. She tried again, choosing her words carefully. "Navy." Walter chuckled gently. "That is a very specific guess." Grace smiled back. Professional curiosity. Walter leaned slightly against his cane. Let us just say I wore a uniform that meant everything to me, and one day I folded it away. Life moved on after that. His answer revealed almost nothing, yet somehow confirmed even more. Grace could hear the humility beneath every sentence. People who exaggerated their accomplishments usually filled every silence with stories. Walter did exactly the opposite. At that moment, Dr. Brandon Keller crossed the waiting room again, accompanied by a younger physician discussing patient assignments. Keller noticed Grace still seated beside Walter and frowned slightly. "Mitchell," he called from several feet away, "you really should be heading home. We cannot have staff socializing with patients while off duty. It creates unnecessary confusion." His tone was not harsh, merely practical, but several people nearby turned to look. Grace stood politely. "Yes, doctor." Walter offered Keller a courteous nod that received little more than a brief acknowledgement before the physicians continued down the hallway discussing laboratory schedules and bed availability. As the conversation faded into the distance, Walter quietly adjusted his coat. The movement caused the bronze emblem to catch the overhead lights once more. This time Grace noticed tiny engraved letters circling its edge. They were nearly impossible to read from where she stood, but one word was unmistakable: valor. Her breath caught for the briefest moment. During her military medical training, there had only been one organization she could remember connected to that exact inscription. The realization sent a chill through her. If her memory was correct, Walter Hayes was not simply an elderly veteran waiting for his name to be called. He belonged to a chapter of American military history so extraordinary that even experienced service members spoke about it with quiet respect. And suddenly Grace knew she could not rely on memory alone. Before saying another word to Walter, she needed proof. Grace walked away from the waiting room at an unhurried pace, careful not to give Walter the impression that anything unusual had happened. The moment she reached the employee corridor, however, her composure gave way to quiet urgency. She stopped outside the staff lounge, reached into her pocket for her phone, and searched through a list of contacts she had not touched in years. Most belonged to instructors, former colleagues, and retired service members who had helped shape the person she had become before she entered civilian nursing. One name immediately stood out: Commander Samuel Brooks, retired. He had taught military medical ethics during her final training course and possessed an almost impossible memory for military history. Grace pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before an older, steady voice answered. "Grace Mitchell. That is a pleasant surprise." She smiled despite the tension in her chest. "Good morning, sir. I hope I am not interrupting anything." "Nothing that cannot wait. What is on your mind?" Grace lowered her voice even though no one else stood nearby. "Sir, I need your help identifying something. I am looking at an elderly veteran wearing a small bronze insignia. It has the word valor engraved around the edge. I also caught a glimpse of an identification card that appears to be more than 50 years old. Does that combination mean anything to you?" Silence filled the line. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. Finally, Commander Brooks spoke again, much more slowly than before. "Describe the insignia." Grace carefully explained every detail she had observed, from the size of the emblem to the worn finish and the placement beneath the man's coat collar. She had barely finished before Brooks quietly exhaled. "Grace, are you absolutely certain?" "As certain as I can be without examining it closely." Another pause followed. "If you are describing what I think you are describing, there were very few recipients. Most people in uniform would never recognize it because it was never intended for public display. It identified men whose service remained largely unspoken for decades." Grace felt the hairs on her arms rise. Could someone simply purchase a replica? Brooks answered immediately. "No, not that one." Grace glanced toward the waiting room entrance. Walter remained exactly where she had left him, sitting quietly with his cane beside him while people continued passing without a second glance. "Sir, the gentleman's name is Walter Hayes." The silence returned, longer this time. Grace could almost hear Brooks searching through memories accumulated across an entire career. When he finally spoke, his voice carried unmistakable emotion. "Walter Hayes." He repeated the name almost as though he had not heard it spoken aloud in years. "Stay exactly where you are." Grace's heartbeat accelerated. "You know him?" "I never met him personally." Brooks answered carefully. "But during my first assignment, one of my commanding officers spoke about a man by that name." Not because he wanted recognition. Quite the opposite. He refused interviews, declined ceremonies, and disappeared into civilian life the moment his service ended. Grace swallowed quietly. Are you telling me this could actually be him? I am telling you that if it is him, you are sitting a few feet away from someone whose decisions saved far more lives than history books will ever record. Grace looked through the glass doors leading back into the waiting room. Walter accepted a smile from a volunteer who had finally arrived with a blanket for another patient. He thanked the volunteer even though the blanket was not for him. His kindness seemed as natural as breathing. Commander Brooks spoke again. Grace slowly lowered the phone, her eyes never leaving the quiet, elderly man across the lobby. For the first time since noticing the bronze emblem, doubt had completely disappeared. Only one question remained. Telephones rang behind the reception desk. Nurses exchanged patient updates while monitors produced their steady rhythm of electronic beeps. Yet to Grace, every ordinary sound seemed strangely distant. Commander Brooks had confirmed what her instincts had already begun to believe. Walter Hayes was not simply an elderly veteran. He was one of those exceptionally rare individuals whose greatest contributions had remained almost entirely outside public recognition. She took a slow breath, straightened the collar of her navy blue scrubs, and quietly returned to the waiting room. Walter remained seated exactly where she had left him, patiently watching raindrops collect on the large windows overlooking the parking lot. His paper cup of water rested untouched beside him. The bronze emblem beneath his collar reflected the overhead lights once more before disappearing into shadow. Grace stopped several feet away. She no longer saw an anonymous patient waiting for his name to be called. She saw decades of quiet sacrifice carried with remarkable humility. For a brief moment, she remembered another conversation from military training. A senior instructor had once told her, "When you meet someone who carried burdens so others would not have to, respect is not something you feel. It is something you show." Those words echoed clearly in her mind. Walter noticed Grace approaching and smiled with the same gentle kindness he had shown every person who acknowledged him that morning. "You are still here," he said warmly. "I thought your shift had ended." Grace nodded softly. "It did." She paused before continuing. "But there was something I needed to do before I went home." Walter looked at her with quiet curiosity. "And what would that be?" Grace did not answer immediately. Instead, she took one slow step backward, allowing enough space between them. Her shoulders straightened instinctively, almost entirely through muscle memory formed years earlier. Her breathing became slow and steady. Several people sitting nearby glanced toward her without understanding why she had suddenly changed her posture. A young nurse walking toward the reception desk slowed her pace. Even Dr. Brandon Keller, exiting a nearby hallway with two residents, noticed Grace standing perfectly still in the middle of the waiting room. The conversations around them gradually softened as curiosity spread through the lobby. Grace raised her right hand with calm precision, every movement measured, deliberate, and deeply respectful. Her fingers reached the edge of her eyebrow in a flawless military salute. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only profound gratitude. Walter's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. For the first time that morning, genuine surprise crossed his weathered face. He looked at Grace's expression, searching quietly for an explanation, but found only sincerity. Neither of them spoke. The silence itself became part of the moment. Grace held the salute with unwavering composure, yet tears slowly gathered in her eyes before slipping silently down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness. They were the quiet tears that appeared when respect, gratitude, and memory arrived all at once. Every lesson she had learned about service, sacrifice, and honor seemed to stand before her in the form of one humble elderly man who had expected nothing from anyone. Walter slowly rose from his chair, leaning gently on his cane. His movements were careful but dignified. He looked directly into Grace's eyes for several long seconds before offering the smallest nod, the kind exchanged only between people who understood that some words were simply too important to interrupt with conversation. The waiting room had become completely silent. Dr. Keller stopped walking. The residents beside him lowered their voices. Receptionists looked up from their computers. Families waiting for appointments stared across the lobby without knowing what they were witnessing. No announcement had been made. No explanation had been offered. Yet everyone instinctively sensed they had just stepped into a moment far greater than an ordinary morning inside a hospital. And as Grace slowly lowered her hand, Walter quietly returned the salute with the same calm precision of a man who had never forgotten what that simple gesture truly meant. Walter's hand remained raised for only a few seconds before he slowly lowered it again, but the silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire waiting room. Nobody returned to their conversations. Nobody looked back at their phones. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the elderly man and the nurse standing before him. Dr. Brandon Keller finally stepped forward, his expression filled less with irritation than genuine confusion. "Grace," he asked carefully, "what is happening?" Grace wiped a single tear from her cheek before answering. "Doctor, with your permission, I would like to verify something." Keller glanced from Grace to Walter and nodded. "Go ahead." Grace turned respectfully toward Walter. "Sir, would you allow me to ask you one question?" Walter smiled gently. "You already have. Did you ever serve with the Valor Reconnaissance Program?" The question seemed almost to stop time itself. Walter did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the bronze insignia beneath his collar and lightly touched it with 2 fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice remained quiet. "It has been many years since anyone used that name." Grace lowered her eyes for a brief moment, almost overwhelmed by the confirmation. Dr. Keller frowned. "Valor Reconnaissance Program?" One of the younger residents quietly admitted, "I have never heard of it." Grace looked toward them. "Most people have not." Before she could continue, her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. "Commander Samuel Brooks." She answered immediately and placed the call on speaker after receiving Walter's gentle nod of approval. "Commander Brooks," Grace said respectfully. The older man's voice filled the quiet waiting room. "Grace, I made 2 calls after we spoke. I wanted to be absolutely certain before saying another word." Every person nearby listened without interruption. Brooks continued. "The Department of Veterans Affairs confirmed that Walter Hayes is enrolled under a protected service classification. I also reached an old friend who served at the Pentagon decades ago. He remembered Hayes personally." Dr. Keller folded his arms, listening intently. Brooks continued speaking. "Walter Hayes spent much of his military career in assignments that were never intended for public attention. His work focused on protecting service members during some of the most dangerous humanitarian and recovery operations of his generation. Many details remain classified even today, but one fact has never been questioned. Countless Americans came home because men like Walter Hayes quietly did their jobs without asking for recognition." A receptionist slowly covered her mouth with one hand. The young resident stared at Walter with growing disbelief. Brooks continued, his voice becoming softer. "There is a saying among some retired officers. If you ever meet Walter Hayes, thank him before you ask him any questions. You probably owe him more than you realize." Grace looked toward Walter again. The elderly veteran seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. He gave a small shake of his head as though hoping the conversation would end. "Commander," Walter said calmly, speaking toward the phone for the first time. "That was a long time ago." Brooks laughed warmly. "Perhaps, but time does not erase honor, Walter." The line became quiet for a moment before Brooks added one final sentence. "Please tell him something for me, Grace." "Yes, sir. Tell him there are still people who remember." Grace repeated the message softly. Walter closed his eyes for just a brief second before opening them again. His smile remained humble, but something had changed within it. It carried gratitude mixed with surprise, as though he had never truly expected to hear those words again. Around the waiting room, people who had ignored him only minutes earlier now looked at him with completely different eyes. They still did not know every chapter of his story, but they finally understood one important truth. The quiet, elderly man sitting alone by the window had never been ordinary. The only ordinary thing had been how easily the world had overlooked him. For several moments no one spoke. The waiting room, which only minutes earlier had been filled with impatient sighs and distracted conversations, now carried a completely different atmosphere. It was quieter, gentler, almost reverent. Dr. Brandon Keller slowly walked toward Walter Hayes, no longer with the hurried confidence of a physician managing a busy schedule, but with the careful pace of a man realizing he had overlooked something deeply important. He stopped a few feet away and extended his hand. "Mr. Hayes," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. This morning I saw only another patient waiting for care. I should have taken the time to see the person sitting in front of me. Walter accepted the handshake with a warm smile. Doctor, there is nothing to apologize for. Hospitals are busy places. You have people to care for. Keller gently shook his head. Being busy is not the same as truly seeing people. I forgot that today. Grace quietly stepped back, allowing the moment to belong to Walter. Around the room, several nurses gathered near the reception desk. One of the younger nurses whispered softly to another. He waited here for almost an hour and never once complained. The other nurse looked toward Walter with moist eyes. I cannot imagine carrying a lifetime like that and asking for nothing in return. An elderly woman who had been waiting with her husband slowly approached Walter. Sir, she said gently, my father served many years ago. He always told us that the bravest people were usually the quietest. I think I understand what he meant now. Walter smiled kindly. Your father sounds like a wise man. The woman nodded before quietly returning to her seat. A few moments later, the volunteer coordinator entered the waiting room, carrying a wheelchair for another patient. After hearing a brief explanation from one of the receptionists, she walked directly toward Walter. Mr. Hayes, she said softly, would you allow us to move you somewhere more comfortable while you wait? Walter glanced around the room before smiling. Thank you, but this chair has treated me just fine. The coordinator smiled back. Then perhaps we can at least bring you some fresh coffee. Walter chuckled. Now that would be difficult to refuse. Gentle laughter spread through the waiting room, easing the emotion without diminishing the respect everyone now felt. Dr. Keller turned toward the nursing staff. Please adjust today's schedule. Several employees looked up immediately. Mr. Hayes will be escorted directly to an examination room. I will personally review his evaluation. Walter immediately raised one hand. Doctor, I appreciate the kindness, but there are people here who arrived before me. Some of them may need help more urgently than I do. Keller answered with genuine respect. You spent your life putting others first. Today we can afford to take care of you. Walter looked around the room. To his surprise, several waiting patients nodded in agreement. A young father holding his daughter's hand smiled warmly. Please go ahead, sir. We are all right waiting a little longer. An older gentleman across the lobby tipped his baseball cap. You earned your turn a long time ago. Walter lowered his eyes for a moment, visibly touched by the generosity surrounding him. Grace watched quietly from a short distance away. Only an hour earlier, these same strangers had barely noticed the elderly man sitting alone beside the window. Nothing about Walter had changed since then. His coat was still worn. His cane still carried the marks of many years. His voice remained gentle and humble. The only thing that had changed was what people now understood about him. They had finally looked beyond appearances and discovered the extraordinary character that had always been there. As Walter slowly stood, nearly everyone in the waiting room instinctively rose with him. No one had asked them to stand. No announcement had been made. It simply felt like the right thing to do. And in that quiet hospital lobby, respect spread naturally from one person to another until an ordinary Tuesday morning became a memory none of them would ever forget. Walter Hayes completed his examination later that afternoon, and to no one's surprise, the results showed nothing more serious than exhaustion, mild dehydration, and the ordinary challenges that sometimes accompany 82 remarkable years. Dr. Brandon Keller personally walked him back through the hallway instead of asking an orderly to do it. Along the way, nurses, physicians, receptionists, volunteers, and even maintenance workers greeted Walter with warm smiles that had not been there when he first entered the hospital that morning. None of them treated him like a celebrity. They treated him like something even more meaningful, a man whose quiet life deserved genuine respect. Before Walter reached the front entrance, the hospital administrator stepped forward carrying a small folded American flag that had been displayed every Veterans Day in the hospital lobby. Mr. Hayes, she said gently, this flag has welcomed thousands of patients over the years. If you would accept it, we would be honored for it to accompany you home today. Walter looked at the flag for a long moment before carefully accepting it with both hands. I cannot take something that belongs to the hospital, he replied softly. The administrator smiled. Today it belongs to gratitude. Walter lowered his head for a brief moment, unable to speak immediately. Grace stood nearby, watching quietly as the elderly veteran carefully folded the flag once more with practiced hands before holding it close to his chest. As everyone prepared to say goodbye, Walter reached into the inside pocket of his weathered coat and removed the old leather document holder Grace had noticed earlier. He opened it carefully and withdrew a small bronze challenge coin, its surface polished smooth by decades of being carried through every chapter of his life. He turned toward Grace and held it in his open palm. "Nurse Mitchell," he said gently, "this coin has reminded me every day that service is never about being remembered. It is about remembering why you chose to serve in the first place." Grace immediately shook her head. "Sir, I could never accept something so important." Walter smiled with quiet certainty. "I am not giving away my memories. I am passing along the responsibility they represent." Grace slowly extended both hands and accepted the coin with visible emotion. It felt surprisingly heavy for something so small. Around its edge, the engraved word Valor caught the afternoon sunlight shining through the hospital entrance. Walter continued speaking. "This morning you were the only person who looked closely enough to see an old man instead of an inconvenience. Never lose that gift. Hospitals will always have machines that can measure heartbeats, but they will never invent one that measures compassion. That remains our responsibility." Grace's eyes filled once again as she nodded silently. Dr. Keller stepped beside her and said, "Mr. Hayes, today you reminded every one of us why medicine begins with seeing the person before seeing the chart." Walter smiled warmly. "Then today has been worthwhile." As the automatic doors opened, the cool November air drifted into the lobby. Walter paused just outside before turning back one final time. Nearly every employee visible from the entrance had quietly gathered along the hallway. Without any announcement or instruction, they stood together in respectful silence. Grace instinctively raised her hand in one final salute. This time she was not alone. Dr. Keller placed his hand respectfully over his heart. The nurses stood proudly beside one another. Several veterans waiting for appointments offered their own salutes. Other visitors simply stood with quiet gratitude, understanding that they were witnessing something rare. Walter returned the salute with the same calm dignity that had defined every moment of the day. Then he lowered his hand, smiled one last time, and walked slowly toward the parking lot beneath the gray autumn sky, carrying nothing more than a folded flag and a lifetime of humble service. Long after he disappeared from view, the hospital seemed strangely different. The walls had not changed. The waiting room had not changed. The schedules, charts, and monitors remained exactly the same. But every person who had been there understood something they had forgotten in the rush of ordinary life. Sometimes the greatest heroes never ask the world to remember them. They simply hope that when someone finally does, kindness will be the first thing they see. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today and for staying until the very end of this story. Your support means far more than you might imagine. Every single view, every thoughtful comment, every like, and every subscription helps us continue creating stories that honor courage, kindness, humility, and the extraordinary people who often go unnoticed in everyday life. Here at The Hidden Nurse, we believe that the greatest heroes are not always the loudest voices or the most famous names. Sometimes they are the quiet nurse who chooses compassion when no one is watching. Sometimes they are the forgotten veteran sitting alone in a waiting room. Sometimes they are ordinary people carrying extraordinary stories that deserve to be remembered. That is the heart of this channel. We are here to share inspiring stories about hidden strength, selfless service, quiet resilience, and the moments when true character is finally recognized. Our hope is that every story reminds us to look beyond appearances, to treat others with dignity, and to remember that every person we meet may be carrying a history we cannot see. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply reminded you of the importance of kindness and respect, we would truly appreciate it if you would take a moment to click the like button. It is a simple action, but it helps these stories reach more people who may need a little hope or encouragement today. If you have not already joined our community, we warmly invite you to subscribe to The Hidden Nurse and turn on notifications so you will never miss a new story. We have many more unforgettable journeys waiting for you, filled with remarkable people whose quiet acts of courage deserve to be celebrated. We also love hearing from our viewers. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Has someone in your life ever shown quiet courage that changed the way you see the world? Have you met an everyday hero whose story deserves to be told? We read your comments with gratitude, and your stories continue to inspire the work we do. Thank you once again for choosing to spend part of your day with us. Until we meet again in the next story, Take care of yourself. Take care of the people around you. Never underestimate the power of compassion, and never forget that the greatest acts of courage are often performed quietly, with no expectation of recognition, but they have the power to change lives forever. We look forward to welcoming you back very soon here on The Hidden Nurse.